Hartelijk welkom allemaal bij dit 8e mini-college in de serie Dit hebben we in huis, georganiseerd door de faculteit Geesteswetenschappen van de UvA in samenwerking met SPUI 25 en gemodereerd door Marita Matthijssen en ikzelf, Aafke Hulk. Today the talk will be in English because it's a very special day. It's International Women's Day and we have two speakers today and a very special subject. The speakers are Rosemary Allen, Professor of Culture, Community and History at the University of Curaçao, and Sruti Bala, Associate Professor of Performance and Theatre Studies at our own university. They will talk about the development of women's studies, feminist movement in the islands of the Dutch Caribbean. They will tell us how citizenship is articulated in cultural practices such as theater, film, dance, and poetry. Sruti Bala has studied German literature and philosophy in Bombay and in Bonn. She did her PhD in theater studies at the University of Mainz. And she is now a associate professor at our own university. She was, among other things, a fellow at the International Research Center of Interweaving Performance Cultures at the Freie Universiteit in Berlin. She has given numerous guest lectures across the globe. She has published edited books and journals, and her most recent book is entitled The Gestures of Participatory Art, Manchester University Press. Nowadays, she teaches MA courses, BA courses. She coordinates the MA theater studies at our university, and her research is affiliated to the Amsterdam School of Cultural Analysis and to the Amsterdam Center for Globalization Studies. Her research interests span the areas of participatory and community art, feminist and post-colonial theories in performance and artistic activism. Why is she here together with Professor Rosemary Allen from Curaçao? That is because they coordinate a very interesting NWO-funded research, 5-year research program on cultural practices of citizenship under conditions of fragmented sovereignty, gendered and sexual citizenship in the Dutch Caribbean. So Rosemary Allen is a cultural anthropologist. She studied sociology and cultural and social anthropology at the University of Nijmegen. She got her PhD in Utrecht and is now a senior lecturer at the University of Curaçao. She has many other things she does. Among other things, she is currently assisting the Ministry of Culture in preparing a new cultural policy and in founding a new cultural studies undergrad program at the University of Curaçao. She is awarded a knighthood, ridder, in the Order of Oranje Nassau for her exceptional contributions to society. And she's got other awards and prizes. In her dissertation, she emphasizes the close relationship between culture and power in daily life. Her areas of special interest are emancipation, oral history, identity, migration, and gender. She has published several books and numerous articles in international journals. She was also a fellow here in Amsterdam at the Amsterdam School for Social Sciences a couple of years ago. But today she's here to talk together with Sruti. They will talk about the development of women's studies, feminist movements in the islands of the Dutch Caribbean. And the title of their talk is Gender and Citizenship in the Dutch Caribbean. They will talk for about 30 minutes, and you can ask questions in using the Q&A button. After the talk, they will answer your questions. If there are too many questions, I will make a selection or combine several ones. But you may ask your questions either in English or in Dutch, but they will present their work in English. I now give the floor to Sruti and Rosemary.
Thank you very much, Afka. Thank you for this invitation to present in the series. Rosemary, we could begin with the slide. So yeah, I'd like to also welcome everybody by wishing us an uplifting and a spirited International Women's Day. We cannot hold hands and march together and celebrate the struggles and achievements of generations of women around the world. So I am so glad we have this opportunity to share with you some glimpses of our ongoing research. I will be doing this presentation together with my dear colleague, Rosemary Allen, most recently appointed Professor of Culture, Community and History at the University of Curaçao, from where she's speaking now. Next slide, Rosemary. So we can go to the next one. So our presentation today, we will cover 3 points. I will begin with a kind of general appraisal of the challenges of thinking gender in the context of the Caribbean, a kind of theoretical conceptual framework. Rosemary will then speak about some of the main trends and developments in women's and gender studies, with a focus on Curaçao. And in the end, I will briefly speak about some examples of artistic and cultural practices of gendered citizenship. Next slide, Rosemary. So Rosemary and I, as Afka introduced in the beginning, have been working together in a 5-year research project funded by the NWO on cultural practices of citizenship in the context of the Dutch Caribbean. Our project team also consists of 2 doctoral scholars, Aronette Martis, based at the University of Curaçao, and Wigpertson Julian Isenia, based at the University of Amsterdam. We are working at the intersection of the social sciences and the humanities. Rosemary, as Afka introduced, is an anthropologist, and I am trained in literary and theater studies. The PhD projects also involve a combination of cultural artistic case studies and conceptual theoretical frameworks that are informed by gender studies, citizenship studies, and cultural anthropology. So maybe not all our viewers or listeners who are joining us are aware that in the context of the Caribbean, citizenship is a very complicated thing. A complex thing. It can mean simultaneously many things. To be a citizen of an island such as Curaçao means you are a citizen of one of the special municipalities or constituent countries within the Kingdom of the Netherlands. At the same time, you may be a Dutch passport holder. You are a European citizen as well as a Caribbean citizen. So in our project, we are departing from this premise that there are many more angles to citizenship than just the legal and constitutional angle. So citizenship needs to be valued not only in terms of rights and obligations, but also citizenship also refers to a repertoire of cultural practices and articulations. So we are interested in how people perform their citizenship, their claims to citizenship. And in this, cultural practices, artistic expressions, language, imagination become very important to the ways in which the claims to citizenship are performed. And given the history of citizenship in the Caribbean that is inevitably tied to the history of colonialism, our research is very interested in how citizenship is articulated by subjects facing multiple forms of systemic inequalities. So the conceptual framework is called citizenship from below. So we are looking at the perspectives of marginalized subject positions. And in this, the doctoral project of Aronette Martis, for example, deals with the role of dance in the formation of a national identity, how dance forms such as tambu become the sites for both contesting norms of respectability and virtue, and have also been transformed into symbols of national pride. The PhD project of Julian Esenia looks at the cultural practices of sexual minorities on the islands and their claims to inclusion as citizens. Next slide, please. So very briefly, some notes on this complex intertwining of gender and citizenship. This is, of course, a very vast area of theorization, and we could come back to it in the discussion later, but I will very briefly touch on it. So in Caribbean feminist scholarship, many scholars have compellingly argued that the very category of citizen in the context of the Caribbean is entrenched in nationalist frameworks and in the powerful institutions of the Roman Catholic Church. Historically, women have been excluded from citizenship, and not just women, also the enslaved, and as well as other subjects deemed as abnormal. And usually these are using arguments around notions of propriety, respectability, etc. And these discourses tend to extend well into the present day, although they are covered under the mantle of development. But more broadly speaking, the idea of a nation is very often delineated in gendered terms. So think, for example, how common it is for us to speak of the birth of a nation or of adopting citizenship. We speak of founding fathers and sons of the soil and motherlands and mother tongues. Think also how the heterosexual family is very, very broadly seen as the structural unit, basic structural unit of the nation. Colonizing nations are often depicted as the parents and the colonized as children, and values attached to a nation often tend to carry gendered sexual connotations. Women's bodies and lives in particular are the bearers of national pride and respectability. So with this broader framework, bearing this in mind, I would like to move now to talk about what have feminist movements and what have women's studies and research in gender studies, what are the trends and developments, what are the moves that they have made in researching gender in the context of the Caribbean. So I now hand over to Rosemary to speak about this from here. Rosemary, you need to unmute.
Okay, thank you very much, Sruti. I would like to congratulate the women's today for their celebration of this day. And I think it's very important that we have this conversation regarding women, which goes beyond the national boundaries. In the context of gender and citizenship, I will look at feminism and relate it to women's and gender studies in Curaçao, Dutch Caribbean. First, I will give a working definition of feminism, and I'll define feminism as activist movement based on a body of ideas that underline the need for a positive transformation of society such that women are not marginalized but are treated as full citizens in all spheres of life. But in my presentation, I also go beyond this definition and look at women's behavior that, although it generally does not get labeled as feminism, involve collective action based upon thoughts and dreams by which women identify themselves and defy the spaces which they occupy within patriarchal power relation. I would like to call this the non-formal feminism and incorporate it within the more formalized feminism that has resulted in women's and gender studies. Women in the Dutch Caribbean often acted autonomously and independently. For example, in the multifocal family system, when engaged in non-durable man-woman relationships, women acted as the head of the household. And this is even true in the more formalized marriage relationships. For example, in the past, many men will immigrate to look for work elsewhere, or they will work as sailors on ships. For this reason, Bonaire, the other Dutch Caribbean island that is also part of our project, was for a long time even referred to as an island of women. And during an ethnographic study on that island in 1985, An informer born in 1905 referred to Bonairean women as mue macho, meaning women who behaved like men, women who stand their ground. Women's resilience in the face of economic hardship manifested itself also in various forms. One example is a traditional saving system called SAM, literally meaning together. And in this system, people deposit some money into a communal pot on a weekly basis. Each participant received the total amount in the pot after one rotation, as agreed upon at the start. The SAM is coordinated by a Kabezi SAM, who in most cases is a woman. Another example, which I think is very important to focus on, is what is called the Cambrada system. And in the Cambrada system, women in a same-sex relationship would adopt children from those who are financially unstable to raise their children. Women would assume ownership of their life by moving outside the colonial boundaries, as recent studies have shown. For example, Linda Rupert has examined how Curaçaoan enslaved women participated alongside free people in the contraband trade between South America and Curaçao. Tom Dahl mentioned in his 2012 master thesis that during slavery, freed Curaçaoan women would buy goods in Puerto Rico and sell them in St. Thomas, a practice very much condemned by the St. Thomas white elite. An example that falls within the usual way of defining feminism is the role of Curaçaoan women in the acquirement of general suffrage. Before general suffrage became a reality in Curaçao in 1948, only men over the age of 25 with a certain level of education and property ownership were allowed to vote. This meant that a vast majority of the people, including most of the African-descended population and women in particular, were deprived of one of their fundamental citizenship rights, and that is participation in political decision-making. In the local struggle for universal suffrage, women played a very active role, breaking through the barrier placed upon them because of their race and gender. And that you can see in an article I wrote, Negotiating Gender, Citizenship, and Nationhood through Universal Adult Suffrage in Curaçao. Curaçaoan women overcame the local social barrier by organizing themselves and opening critical spaces available to them. They succeeded in gaining international support, as Margot Grunewald's study called Women Mobilization in the Dutch Caribbean shows. They connected with women in the colonial motherland as allies for acquiring voting rights in the colony. And in the 70s, you see also women movements that are very important, which I will deal with when I will be talking about the studies on women and gender. Please, my computer is like, there you go. What the hell is this? I have to go to the other slide. Yeah, okay. The slide I would like to show is that in
Rosemary, should I pull up this slide from my screen? If you can.
Yes, well, please do, because I think I have some problem with
you could stop sharing
yes.
on your screen.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, and then Sruti will start. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Okay. During the previous slide, I included example of how non-formal feminist action has been documented in certain studies. And if we look at research on women also as an expression of feminism, we can identify several key areas of gender research in Curaçao based on scope, diversity, and complexity, which I will discuss separately. These are, for example, studies looking at women from an outsider perspective. B, studies based on themes identified by international institutions. C, studies aimed at public policies, social engineering, and national development, and D, studied raising critical question from autonomous critical discourse. Next slide, please. Okay, in the first category, that is studies looking at women from an outsider perspective, the researcher typically does not live on the island and does not necessarily share the identity, language, and culture of the subject being studied. This category includes especially the studies done in the 1960s on family, conjugal, and kinship patterns. Although these studies were not specifically gender-oriented, they engage with women in an attempt to understand local family and conjugal patterns which were seen as deviant from the European standard. According to the Eurocentric ideal, the household was a legally and religiously sanctioned unit which consisted of a mother who bore and raised children, a father who was the head of the family, and their children. In these studies, the focus was on Black families, in which women held a dominant position, while fathers and other men were completely absent or only marginally present, and which were considered to be dysfunctional, supposedly because of slavery. In the course of time, we see that also this research category came to include studies motivated in particular by social problems encountered by the Dutch Antillian diaspora in the Netherlands. The next slide, please. The second gendered research category covers studies of scholarly engagement with women as identified by international institutions. The United Nations International Women Year in 1975 and the International Women Decades, which range from 1976 till 1985, internalized women issues and also brought them to the forefront of national discussion on the Dutch Caribbean islands. In the anticipation of the International Women Year, the Federal Bureau of Social Welfare was established in 1974, and the steering committee consisting of about 60 organizations was also established. The Bureau received the mandate to provide counsel to the government regarding the unequal social and legal situation of the Dutch Antillian women. Subsequently, research on gender was conducted as an instrument to produce a body of knowledge on gender issues and to solve specific problems and concerns. One such study was the inventory made by the government-appointed committee of all discriminatory rules and regulations with the Civil Code of the Netherlands Antilles in relation to the status of women in general. The study had a very concrete effect, namely the cancellation of the legal incapacity of married women in 1975. In the 1990s, Curaçao participation in various ECLA conferences led to more practical research seen as relevant to the design and execution of policy for the improvement of the position of women in the society. Important to mention is the Interdepartmental Advisory Group officially established in 1991 under the presidency of the then director of the Bureau of Women's Affairs of the Netherlands Antilles, the sociologist Bernadette Dougal. It aimed at integrating a gender perspective in all government policy matters, including through research. Since Curaçao became an autonomous country within the Kingdom of the Netherlands in 2010, gender and development issues have remained subject of attention for the Ministry of Social Development, Labor and Well-being, as Curaçao continues to deal with the complex demand of both diversity and unity in the reconstruction of what is generally believed to be a new country and society. And if one look at Adelis Rodriguez's 2015 dissertation, it shows how international institutions and treaties, such as the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, have been used in Curaçao to address gender stereotypes and to improve the position of women and strengthen their rights within the family, both by the government as well as the NGO in their shadow reports. Next slide, please. A third set of studies are structures around themes expected to play an instrumental role in supporting public policy, social engineering, and national development. These studies originate especially from the concern of activist groups that define the research theme and question, while execution sometimes takes place through government or independent donor funding. In this way, critical questions from the grassroots of the society get raised and tackled. These studies seek to raise consciousness and to erase false or distorted perception. The research team centers around subjects such as teenage pregnancy, disability, educational underperformance of boys, induced abortion and contraception, and gender-based violence. Special mention should be made made of the late Sonia Quales and the CAFRA. And the CAFRA stands for Caribbean Association for Feminist Research and Action and was established in Barbados in 1985. They believe that research should not be done for its sake, but must be part of a strategy to develop new approaches for understanding and acting upon issues relevant to women. Also, I should mention the Uma Uyongwe Antiano that combined activism and research. My 2019 paper called An Exploration of Women and Gender Studies in Curaçao provides an overview of such studies that deal with issues like labor and employment, health, gender-based violence, and gender and sexuality. It also mentioned the evolving role of the University of Curaçao, which increasingly functions as a kind of powerhouse for knowledge production, both by using local and international funding and by stimulating PhD research. Examples in relation to gender and women's studies are de Vrouwen van de Nederlandse Antillen en Aruba naar een betere toekomst. And also the recent PhD dissertation of Odette Grigori, Father Absence. The next slide, please. The fourth category, and a trend which I think is worthwhile examining, consists of studies aimed at new and critical theoretical understanding of gendered relationship in the Dutch Caribbean. Examples are studies that look at how the coloniality of power is reproduced through race, class, and gender domination. And in the effort to conceptualize Dutch Caribbean feminism, it is important to keep in mind that in the Caribbean, gender operates within the contested space of the existing societal power structure of class and race. And one cannot study gender and citizenship without looking at how it has historically been shaped by class, race, and ethnicity. Historical studies are very relevant and are in the forefront of this research category. And I would like to mention Noda Roemer's Knepa 1980 thesis, Vrouwen Leven op Curaçao, which can be considered an eye-opener as it was the first to examine the position of women during slavery in Curaçao by looking at stratification among women, highlighting the double exploitation of enslaved women in terms of gender and color. It was an issue also taken on by Sonia Quales, who analyzed the peripheral position of women from a more intersectional perspective by looking at how race and class intersected with gender and citizenship. Also, Jana Ricas, which by the way was the first local woman to do gender study in the end of the 1980s, and who published her thesis From the Womb, Curaçao Women Speak Out About Their Identity. This intersectional approach is present more and more in studies, such as the one on prostitution by Jacqueline Martens of 1999, the above mentioned study by Margot Groenewold, and several studies by myself on migration. Also important is the move away from analyzing society in terms of male, female, and masculine, feminine binaries, which is visible in the upcoming study by Julian Isenia, and which is under the auspice of the NWO project, Gender and Citizenship in the Dutch Caribbean. And Julia Isenia follows a bit our group's study, a paragraph on unwritten history of lesbian love in the Caribbean, Amor de Cambrada, and Jocelyn Clemencia's publication about queer identity. These new approaches represent changes in methodology, silencing of women, and which involve the de-silencing of women in historical data through the use of oral history. In addition to statistical analysis, other methods are used here that does not allow women to be merely statistic, but instead provide them a present and a voice. Considering the increasing number of published work on women and gender, one can conclude that gender has become more visible on the Dutch Caribbean island, also in academia. Over the years, local scholars have focused on women and gender through historical studies, as well as in studies on labor and employment, health, gender-based violence, and gender and sexuality. They have emphasized previously ignored subjects and introduced new concepts and methods. In today's presentation, I've dealt mostly with Curaçao than with the rest of the Dutch Caribbean. Each island has its own particularities when it comes to gender and culture, and this requires serious comparative scholarly investigation. Recently, the University of Curaçao installed a chair on on culture, community, and history. And even though the chair does not carry the term gender in its name, it recognized that in the study of culture, community, and history, one cannot be doing serious study without gender as an underlying point of attention. This showed that the study of gender in Curaçao is slowly achieving the disciplinary legitimacy that is already achieved in the other part of the kingdom and in the other part of the Caribbean. And it is hoped that the support for gender studies and for discipline like cultural study with a strong feminist gender focus will be continued on a more sustained basis. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Sruti and Rosemary Allen. This was really a very, very interesting overview of the situation in the Dutch Caribbean. I heard many things I didn't really know, and I'm sure there will be people who would like to ask some questions. So please use the Q&A button for your questions, and there is already one question. Did really the different research projects, the outcomes of the research project, did they really had an effect on the position of women in Curaçao?
Oh yes. For example, research on female gender-based violence, for example, make people more aware about this problem. And also you see that the government starts paying more attention to this problem. So these studies have also, besides being more directed on the theoretical part, they also focus on the practical part and also led slowly, for some people, not fast enough, but slowly more attention is being given to these problems that engage in the emancipation of women in the society.
So the politics in Curaçao have also changed during that period. The politics towards women, the position of women, and
yes, of course, it doesn't go so quickly as one would like to have it, but it is changing. You see it, for example, in the part of the participation of women in politics, and which brings about an awareness of the situation of women in the society, hopefully. Slowly it is being, you see that the situation is changing. And in particular, when you look at the younger generation, you will see certain issue which, yeah, for them, it's just not a problem anymore. They have a different starting position, which will continue, and they can pay more attention to other problems which are important in the society. There is a lot to do in the society. For example, the fact that in most families are female-headed families, which has its problem, of course, in particular, you have with the feminization of poverty and those issues. So there is a lot to be done at the moment on this aspect, but it is a process. I see it as a process, and it is slowly gaining momentum.
Yes, and someone is asking, so is research in this context by definition also activism?
It is. You can see it like that. I don't like to make the distinction between activism and research, because through activist manners, you see that the NGOs and other grassroots societies, they bring forward the problems which are present in the basis. And it is important that there is a link between the people who are working on the base at grassroots level can bring about issues which are present in the society. So it's a combination of two. Like I said, the CAFRA focus on not only doing research, but research as serving a purpose and bringing changes in the mentality, bringing changes in the way of thinking regarding women and regarding men as well. Because slowly you're seeing as well that people are thinking it is not only important to change and to work on the emancipation of women, but he also has to work on the emancipation of the men, because if you only work on the development of women and the men are left behind, so you get this problem that it doesn't coincide anymore. So more and more you see that people are focusing also on the aspect of the development of men in society.
Okay, there's some more questions. Is there a reason, someone asks, why you choose to focus on Curaçao and Bonaire in formulating the research topics instead of the whole of the Dutch Caribbean? Is it different in the other islands, do you think? Or why didn't you include them?
Shall I answer that one, Rosemary?
Yes.
So, in fact, it has to do with practical reasons around the way in which we set up the whole project for the in the context of the NWO application. So, as you might know, the Dutch Caribbean is sort of split in two sets of islands. And the ABC islands, the Aruba, Bonaire, Curaçao, are located closer to the Venezuelan coast, whereas the SSS islands are hundreds of kilometers further away, and there are differences in terms of language, in terms of cultural histories and legacy. So it's quite difficult to say there is a commonality that connects all the 6 islands on their own, apart from the fact that they are all part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Although this very colonial legacy has created also commonalities and points of connection, of course. So and it's also true that a lot of the research on the Dutch Caribbean comes from Curaçao and is related to Curaçao. So the other islands are relatively less investigated, under-researched for number of reasons. And so we hoped to offer a point of comparison, really, with 2 islands to begin with, since we could not possibly cover the complexity of all the 6 islands, and Bonaire being neighboring to Curaçao offered a kind of good comparison for the issues that we were dealing with in the project.
Okay.
And I think
go ahead.
Perhaps I can add something. I think this research should not be seen as a final research. I think in the future, more comparative research between the islands, if according to the funding, because it takes some funding to do that, more comparative research on the different islands is necessary. So I think it's a starting point.
Okay. Here's a question from someone who probably knows more about it. Are differences in developments between the three Dutch Caribbean public bodies and the autonomous Caribbean countries within the kingdom observed since the 10-10-10 reform?
If there are differences, at the moment Bonaire is part of the Netherlands. It has its own issues regarding women. So I think that will make a certain difference in data collection and data interpretation when we are ready and when we are dealing with the outcome of the research. So the development, the political development surely will have some consequences and surely will have some difference in data formulation and in data interpretation because of that difference.
Okay, thank you. There is another question here. Someone who would like to know, I would be curious, she says, to hear more about the humanities side of this project. Is culture analyzed with the humanities methods?
Right.
Maybe, Sruti, you could answer this one, yeah.
If I may, maybe I can return to the slides, because there were a couple of small things that we wanted to share still towards the end, and maybe this is a good moment to do that.
Sure.
So really this overview that Rosemary offered around different strands of research in gender studies and in feminist movements as well is complementary to the kind of approach that we are taking in our research project. But what we are looking for is really artistic cultural practices of women's expressions of claims to citizenship. So just maybe two examples. One is here, this is actually from taken from research that Rosemary herself has conducted as an oral historian. I want to mention two important figures, prominent women in the cultural field in Curaçao, who have contributed in many ways to the visible presence of women in public life on the island, often working single-handedly, often against various odds and barriers. And the first is the tambu performer, the oral artist, Petronilia Petoy, known as Petoy Coco. She's remembered, very popular on the island, remembered as giving voice to popular sentiments, as someone who's giving expression to, particularly to women's experiences. In this song, in this poem song, which is a tambu composition, she sings a kind of typically encoded type of poem containing many sexual innuendos, many kind of double messages, where there is a kind of implicit commentary on the woman's body, which becomes a commodity for use and then becomes discarded. And we are trying to also pay attention to such works and how they are performed, how they give us a sense of women's assertion of their voices in the public domain. Petoy Coco passed away in 2003, but there are many figures who are very active in the cultural life. Jean Enriquez is one mentioned by Rosemary earlier on, and I want to just share a final image here of her. This is Jean Enriquez on the image on the top right, and she's been instrumental in setting up this museum, Museo Kasti Pali Maishi, Kunuku House, a traditional sort of museum which captures the life of women under slavery. So it's a traditional adobe house with a latched roof, thatch roof, and it tries to convey to people about the ordinary day-to-day life of ordinary people who lived on the island, during slavery times. What did their houses look like? What did they eat? What was their language like? How did they communicate with each other? And it's a very unique kind of collection of household artifacts, as well as oral traditions, recipes, proverbs, songs. And it's an educational site because it draws young people and visitors to the island as well, to give them an idea of the material cultures, and centering very much the women's experiences and histories. So in a way, our approach, the cultural approach, to answer your question, would be that women's claims to citizenship do not only take place in the political realm, or in parliamentary legal processes, but they also take place in cultural activities, in artistic practices. And these are valuable because they have such a very strong influence on popular perceptions and attitudes towards gender. So just by way of a sample of the kind of practices that we could cover.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's see, are there other questions for the time being? The differences, the comparative view we've had, the relation with art, which is also very much present in your current project, isn't it? The relation, didn't you mention that one of the PhDs is studying dance also in relation to the citizenship?
Yes, that's right. So the art, you see, I think we have to think of art in a broader spectrum towards cultural practices, because the distinction between art and cultural life is not always so institutionally set or straightforward in these contexts. So dance as a kind of lived art, lived part of social life, and lived art in that sense is part of our interest.
And I think it's important also to focus that the dances look also within the contested spaces, whereby, for example, certain type of dance were not allowed because they were deemed being unrespectable. So that's the dance form Aronet Martis is looking at, and I think it's one of the first studies on dance in the Dutch Caribbean, and which I think will give much insight into the performance and also how dance is linked to citizenship.
And Sruti, you're of course, your specialty is also theater studies. So can you give an example? Someone asks here from theater in this relation.
Well, there are several theater artists and artists who are combining, let's say, performing arts in different forms, spoken word, etc. So I could perhaps mention some of the examples that are being dealt with in the doctoral research of Julian Esenia, the second doctoral candidate on our project, who is studying the work of theater artists like Fridi Martina and Felix de Roy, and others, performing artists from the Caribbean who centered questions of gender and sexuality in their work. So through examining the way in which, let's say, non-normative sexual practices or understandings of selfhood and subjectivity are expressed in performance, we get through the lens of the arts, we get an understanding of how we might see formations of minoritarian understandings of sexuality and as sexual citizenship from the position of the islands. So we are trying to, and in a way, that's the reason why we felt it's important to also give a sense of the history of gender research in the Caribbean, because in a way it began, we have a top-down influenced stake in gender studies, which is strongly influenced by developmental aid, strongly influenced by international institutions and organizations of reshaping, building the nation and the islands in the wake of their semi-autonomy, sort of trying to arrive at some kind of sovereignty within the context of being still attached to the Kingdom of the Netherlands. But at the same time, we have gender studies and movements towards thinking about gender, which come more from a bottom-up grassroots perspective, both activists as well as from cultural art activists and artists who are less interested in questions of development and statehood, and more interested in the complexities of how it is lived and experienced. Yeah.
Yes, a remark, it's not really a question, by someone who says, can I refer you to the study done by Clara Reyes in Sint Maarten on dance, and in particular the Ponem dance? So maybe this is also related to your research.
Yeah, we would certainly welcome communication on that, and we could put you in touch also with our doctoral candidate who would be most happy to pick up on this. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we are more or less at the end of this performance, I would say. I'm very thankful for both of you to giving such a very interesting and special presentation on International Women's Day. I think we learned a lot, and you know, new questions arise, new perspective, but that's just what we want to do with this series of mini collages. So thank you very much. And thank you to all who participated and asked their questions. And I hope you to see the participants again next week when we have Lisa Kuitert, who is talking about boeken in Batavia. So we go to another side of the colonial Dutch position, and she will tell us about as a boekwetenschapper. But for the moment, thank you all very much and have a nice